Hi, so I want to talk about hyperviolence next. This is another node that's really confusing for people. All it does is it takes your overkill, and then it takes 25% of your overkill, and then it adds it as flat damage to your next attack. This has some quirks, you could say. Because it's not just a damage buff, it's a flat number getting added to the attack. I'm like 99% sure that it could be increased by criticals, which means, yes, it is pretty good in a dedicated melee build. And I want to touch on that in a second. So let's start with the good. So this is basically the perfect situation. You don't crit, so this guy does not die. He's got like 1 health. And then you kill him with your crit. Now watch this. Boom. 2136. There's no uncanny stacked up, by the way. So if we look at just a regular hit, so we got about 900 damage from that hyperviolence proc. Excuse me. So we can infer a couple things from that. There's no fucking way I overkilled that guy by 4,000 damage, because that's what it would take to get 1,000 flat damage added. That's not the case. Hitting the head of these guys is still flat, so there's still some damage reduction because I'm not using any rending here. So because of that, it's much more likely that we hit that first guy for about 1,1600, which would give us, in the ballpark of like 500-ish damage, which would then be getting bolstered by the crit, doubled to be about 1,000. So it puts us in the general ballpark we need to be. I would find it incredibly hard to believe I overkilled this guy for like 4K. Okay, so that's the good. Now, here's the bad. This is where hyperviolence doesn't work, because this happens a lot more than people would like to admit. You just flat out kill the guy, and 1298. So, yeah, if you don't get that, like, perfect line, you only get a very insignificant increase of damage. This was like a 5% damage increase from hyperviolence. This happens less the more melee damage you have. So here's a clip of me using it against a horde with the crowbar. Now, I think the crowbar is just about the worst weapon to try and use hyperviolence with. So as you can see, this clip all in all takes, this is 20 of these renegades, by the way. This takes about 13 seconds. Well, if we use the same setup, crowbar, this also takes about 13 seconds without hyperviolence. It really didn't make much of a difference. But this is the kind of node that's pretty hard to do in a test like this. I also think the crowbar is just kind of bad for this node. So if you'd allow me to show you, this is also 20 guys, and this is with the shivs. Now, as you can see, we do 608, and then as soon as we start getting a kill, we do 653, which cleaves into like 500s, and then 785s, and then it just keeps going. And we kill like way quicker like this. Hyperviolence put in a shit ton of work here. I think shivs benefit from hyperviolence a lot more than most other weapons. And that's pretty obvious when we look at just regular stuff like this. So this is just regularly fighting a normal horde in a non-melee build with hyperviolence. And you can see that it really doesn't make much of a difference. We occasionally get an attack that does about 100 extra damage, because this build doesn't have much melee support. That took all in all about 11 seconds. Well, you can see that with no hyperviolence, it's about the same thing. If you don't go in on the melee damage, you just don't do the overkill needed to support it. But when you do, you benefit a ton. In case you're wondering, by the way, this is hypercritical for comparison, which, I mean, you can see for yourself, it just kills faster as a 1-point investment. So if you aren't investing heavily into melee and you only have 1 point to spend, you will get more out of hypercritical than you will out of hyperviolence. But something to consider is with hyperviolence, if you kill something like an elite and then you go into this, well, 704, this is on no melee build. If this was a melee build, this easily would have overkilled this guy for like 200-300, which would have added like 50 damage to the next hit that then gets, you know, doubled on crit, etc. And then you kind of scale the hyperviolence like that. And when you're doing that, it's actually pretty good. So that would be my final takeaway. In a dedicated melee build, especially with like the shiv or the saw, hyperviolence is really good. If you're using something like the crowbar or you're just not using dedicated full-on melee, just go hypercritical. Now, something I'd like to say, I don't think you should ever use hypercritical and hyperviolence at the same time. So if we go back to this clip, when you high roll super hard like this, right here, hypercritical would actually kill this guy. Because 2136 times 2 is 4,000. This guy only has 3,700. Hypercritical would kill this guy. But if you remember, most of the time something like this is going to happen where it doesn't even get you close. And something to consider, because hypercritical is an instant kill effect, if this procs ever, you cannot gain from this. Which means, unless your hit is always going to do substantial overkill, then hypercritical, basically let's put it this way. If your attack doesn't kill in one hit, hypercritical will make it kill in one hit, which is a problem. Because for hyperviolence to really work, what you want to have happen is something like this. Where you hit this guy and now he's like prime for a kill. But if we have hypercritical going, that guy's going to die to it. Which means you can't really set up on trash any good hyperviolence stuff. And if hyperviolence procs, think about this on the flip side. If hyperviolence ever procs, that means you overkilled the thing. Which means you cannot benefit from hypercritical. These nodes are inherently anti-synergistic, and I really don't think they should ever be used together, if I'm being frank with you. I feel like it's just more hypercritical is a good 1-point dip for ranged builds, and hyperviolence is the reward, like, payoff node for melee builds. And they really aren't connected despite the name and shouldn't really be used together. But yeah, all in all, I'd say hyperviolence is a pretty solid node. Okay, well. Oh yeah, one final thing, I guess. It's better in games than it is in the Psychanium. But there will be, like, back-to-back rooms where it barely helps. And then you'll get one room where you'll kill a horde in, like, 3 seconds because of it. It's a very swingy node, and all you really need is that one guy that gets brought down to, like, 1 health, then gets hit with, like, a big critical, and then your next hit just, like, devastates half the horde, which will also overkill something, which, if it overkills it by enough, will also, like, refresh the duration and stuff. That's where the node becomes crazy, but that's not super common. All right, well, I hope you enjoy.